A millionaire humiliates a humble woman, but when she walks into the courtroom as a judge, he regrets it. Grace tightened the laces on her worn-out sneakers and stepped out of her small one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. The morning air was thick with the familiar smells of the city: hot asphalt, distant bagels from the deli down the street, and a faint metallic tang of subway grime. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "Never let them see you quit, Grace." That mantra had carried her through years of juggling two jobs while studying law at night. Today, however, she was just a waitress at Milestone Grill, a mid-tier restaurant in Manhattan, catering to an audience that flaunted privilege like a badge of honor. Across town, Matthew Carter pulled up to the entrance of the restaurant in his sleek black Porsche. The valet boy scrambled to open the door, his nervous hands slightly trembling as he greeted him. Matthew didn't acknowledge the effort. His tailored suit, perfectly coiffed hair, and gold watch screamed wealth. Matthew Carter was not just rich, he was born rich, the kind of man who didn't understand what it meant to have less. And to him, people like Grace barely existed. The two met for the first time under the soft glow of the restaurant's chandeliers. Grace was in her uniform, a crisp white shirt and black slacks that never quite fit right. Her smile was polite but distant as she approached Matthew's table. He was seated with three other young men, their conversation peppered with casual arrogance and laughter that reeked of entitlement. Grace carried the tray with practiced ease, setting down drinks and appetizers with minimal interaction. She had learned to avoid lingering around these types of customers. They were the kind who didn't hesitate to snap their fingers if their water glass wasn't refilled within seconds. "Excuse me," Matthew said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. Grace turned, professional mask in place. "Yes, sir," she replied. He gestured lazily toward his glass. "This is sparkling, not still. I asked for still." His tone was sharp, impatient. Grace nodded. "I'll fix that right away." As she walked away, she caught the faint murmurs of their conversation. "Probably a college dropout or something," one of the men said. Laughter followed. Matthew smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Or maybe she thinks this is as good as it gets for her." The word stung like an open wound. Grace returned to the table, replacing his glass with steady hands and a blank expression. Inside, however, a fire burned. "He'll never know who I really am," she thought. But that night, she cried herself to sleep, the weight of the world pressing against her chest. His words stayed with her, not as a wound, but as fuel. Months turned into years. Grace pushed through grueling shifts, pouring herself into every spare second of studying for her LSATs. While her peers discussed summer internships and prestigious Ivy League connections, she was balancing legal textbooks and trays of hot coffee. She couldn't afford failure. This wasn't just about her, it was about proving people like Matthew wrong. Matthew, meanwhile, ascended in his family's business. He had charm, connections, and the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Deals flowed easily for him, often greased by questionable practices. He didn't see himself as corrupt, just efficient. After all, the world rewarded those who knew how to play the game. But Matthew's world was built on a fragile foundation, and he didn't realize how easily it could crack. One evening, as Grace walked into a community center to attend a mock trial organized by volunteer lawyers, she caught sight of her reflection in the polished glass doors. Gone were the tired eyes and defeated shoulders. She was becoming someone powerful, someone unstoppable. The snide remark Matthew made years ago replayed in her mind. Instead of anger, she felt resolve. Back in Manhattan, Matthew sat in his penthouse, swirling a glass of expensive whiskey. His friends had all left, the night descending into a quiet he rarely enjoyed. It was in these moments that cracks in his self-assured persona began to show, small thoughts of insecurity and unease. But those thoughts never stayed long enough to become realizations. After all, he was Matthew Carter, untouchable. The years that followed saw Grace's resilience shape her into a formidable force. She excelled in law school, carving out a reputation for being sharp, unyielding, and deeply empathetic. She knew what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, and judged by appearances, and she vowed to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. In the bustling heart of New York City, Grace's star was rising. After passing the bar, she began her career as a public defender, taking on cases that no one else wanted. The long hours, meager pay, and overwhelming workload would have crushed anyone else, but Grace thrived on the challenge. Her conviction was her fuel. Each victory, no matter how small, was a testament to her journey. Meanwhile, Matthew's rise in the corporate world was meteoric. He had become the CEO of Carter Industries, a sprawling empire built on construction, energy, and, as it turned out, dubious deals. Contracts awarded under questionable circumstances, kickbacks masked as consultancy fees, and offshore accounts were all part of his modus operandi. To the public, he was a charismatic leader, a philanthropist who donated to high-profile causes and graced the covers of business magazines. Behind closed doors, though, he was feared, a man who wielded power without accountability. On a crisp autumn morning, Grace was sworn in as one of the youngest judges in the New York judicial system. Her mother, now retired and healthy, thanks to Grace's support, sat in the audience, beaming with pride. As Grace took the oath, she felt the weight of her responsibilities settle on her shoulders. She wasn't just a judge. She was a symbol of perseverance, proof that integrity could triumph over privilege. But Grace's professional ascent didn't erase the memories of those who had belittled her. As she walked through the marble halls of the courthouse, her mind occasionally drifted to that night at Milestone Grill, and the man who had made her feel small. She hadn't thought of Matthew Carter in years, but the sting of his words had never entirely faded. Matthew's carefully constructed world began to unravel when an investigative journalist exposed one of his smaller corruption schemes. What started as a local controversy quickly snowballed into a federal investigation. Subpoenas were issued, employees turned whistleblowers, and Matthew found himself at the center of a storm. At first, he dismissed the allegations as an inconvenience. His lawyers assured him that his wealth and influence would shield him from the worst consequences. But as evidence piled up, it became clear that this was no minor scandal. His offshore accounts were traced, his falsified contracts exposed, and his once loyal board members began to distance themselves. One by one, the pillars of his empire crumbled. Banks froze his assets, his name was stripped from charitable boards, and even the media outlets he once controlled turned against him. For the first time in his life, Matthew Carter was vulnerable. The culmination of the investigation led to a federal indictment. Matthew was charged with multiple counts of corruption, fraud, and money laundering. As the trial date approached, he clung to the hope that his charm and a team of high-powered lawyers would tip the scales in his favor. But when he stepped into the courtroom and saw the judge presiding over his case, his confidence wavered. Grace Harper sat at the bench, her expression calm and unreadable. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Matthew's heart sank. He recognized her instantly. For Grace, the moment was equally jarring. She hadn't seen Matthew in over a decade, but his face was unmistakable. Memories of that humiliating night flooded back, but she quickly pushed them aside. Her role was clear: to uphold the law without bias. Justice, not vengeance. The courtroom buzzed as the trial began. Matthew's legal team tried every trick in the book, questioning the integrity of the evidence, painting him as a victim of political machinations, but Grace's impartiality and command of the proceedings left no room for theatrics. She knew the law inside and out, and she wasn't going to let anyone undermine it. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. Reporters crowded the back rows, their pens poised to capture every word of the most sensational corruption trial of the decade. At the defendant's table, Matthew Carter sat in his tailored suit, the very picture of confidence except for the tight grip on his pen and the faint tension in his jaw. His usual composure was cracking under the weight of his circumstances. Across the room, presiding over the trial, Judge Grace Harper exuded calm authority, her gavel resting like a silent sentinel of justice. The sight of her had thrown Matthew off balance on the first day of the trial. He had underestimated her all those years ago, writing her off as insignificant. Now she was the one holding the scales of his fate, and there was no room for manipulation. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They detailed the fraudulent contracts, the offshore accounts, and the testimonies of whistleblowers who described a culture of corruption within Carter Industries. Evidence after evidence was presented, emails, bank statements, and wire transfers that painted a damning picture. Matthew's defense team fought back fiercely, portraying him as a scapegoat and downplaying the severity of the charges. They argued that he had been unaware of the illegal actions of his subordinates, a narrative that Matthew himself clung to during his testimony. When Matthew took the stand, his charm and charisma were on full display. He spoke confidently, weaving a tale of a misunderstood leader who had been betrayed by those he trusted. His words were carefully calculated, his tone disarming. For a moment, he seemed to regain control of the narrative, but Grace's sharp gaze never wavered. She listened intently, dissecting every word. Her questions during cross-examination were precise, cutting through the facade. She didn't allow his theatrics to derail the trial, maintaining an unwavering focus on the facts. The turning point came when the prosecution introduced a key piece of evidence, a recorded phone call between Matthew and one of his executives discussing how to manipulate bids for a lucrative government contract. The recording was damning, shattering the defense's argument of ignorance. The courtroom fell silent as the audio played, Matthew's own voice betraying him. He sat frozen, his once impeccable confidence crumbling. The whispers in the gallery grew louder, reporters scribbling furiously. For the first time, Matthew looked genuinely shaken. Grace remained composed, her expression unreadable. Inside, she felt a storm of emotions, vindication perhaps, but also an overwhelming sense of responsibility. This wasn't about her past with Matthew, it was about upholding the law. As the trial neared its conclusion, Matthew's world continued to unravel. The prosecution's closing arguments left no doubt about his guilt. His defense team, despite their best efforts, couldn't counter the mountain of evidence. The day of the verdict arrived, and the courtroom was silent as the jury foreperson stood. Guilty on all counts, the words echoed, sealing Matthew's fate. He was sentenced to a significant prison term, his assets seized, and his reputation in tatters. As Matthew was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he cast one last glance at Grace. There was no hatred or bitterness in her eyes, only a quiet strength that he couldn't fully comprehend. For the first time, he felt the weight of his choices, not just the illegal ones, but the arrogance and disdain that had defined his life. Grace watched him go, her expression calm but thoughtful. Justice had been served and the system had worked. Yet, as she left the bench that day, she couldn't help but reflect on the fragility of power and the strength it took to rise above it. Years passed, and the shadows of the trial faded from the public's memory. Grace Harper continued to climb the ranks of the judiciary, earning respect not only for her legal acumen, but also for her unyielding commitment to fairness. Her name became synonymous with integrity, a symbol of what could be achieved through perseverance and a steadfast belief in justice. Matthew Carter, however, had been stripped of everything. His sentence had included years in federal prison, during which he faced the harsh reality of his fall from grace. Gone were the luxury cars, the sprawling penthouses, and the constant validation of his wealth and power. In their place were cold steel bars, a narrow cot, and the humbling monotony of prison life. Matthew's time in prison changed him. For the first time, he was forced to confront his actions without the buffer of privilege. He met men who had suffered because of corruption, some directly affected by his schemes, and heard their stories. Slowly, the man who had once dismissed others as beneath him began to see the humanity in those he had overlooked. After his release, Matthew emerged a changed man. He had nothing left but his name and the lessons learned during his incarceration. Determined to rebuild, he threw himself into community work. He volunteered at legal aid clinics, helping underprivileged communities navigate the justice system. He used his connections, what little remained of them, to support initiatives aimed at education and rehabilitation for former inmates. For the first time in his life, Matthew's actions weren't motivated by profit or power, but by a genuine desire to make amends. One crisp spring evening, Grace attended a charity gala hosted by a non-profit she supported. The event was held in a modest community center, far removed from the opulence she often encountered in her professional life. She mingled with young law students, sharing her story and encouraging them to pursue their dreams despite the odds. As she moved through the crowd, she spotted a familiar figure by the refreshment table. Matthew Carter stood there, his posture no longer exuding the arrogance she remembered, but instead a quiet humility. He was speaking to a group of teenagers, animatedly sharing his own story, how he had lost everything and found purpose in helping others. Grace paused, watching him for a moment. The man before her was almost unrecognizable. Their eyes met across the room, and Matthew froze. For a brief moment he seemed unsure whether to approach her. Grace smiled faintly, breaking the tension. He walked over, his steps hesitant but purposeful. "Judge Harper," he began, his voice softer than she remembered. "Matthew," she replied, her tone even. There was a beat of silence before he continued. "I owe you an apology, not just for what happened all those years ago, but for the person I was. I didn't see people. I didn't see you. And I'm sorry." Grace studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she extended her hand. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said simply. "Not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying anger only weighs you down." Matthew shook her hand, his grip firm but respectful. For the first time in years, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Their interaction was brief, but it left an indelible mark on both of them. Matthew continued his work, becoming a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform and using his story as a cautionary tale. Grace, meanwhile, pressed forward in her career, driven by the belief that true justice wasn't just about punishment, but about creating a system that uplifted those it served. Though their paths diverged once again, both found peace in their respective journeys. Grace proved that strength came not from wealth or power, but from perseverance and character. Matthew discovered that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a better future.